Here's something that might surprise you. Not all phosphorus is created equal. This mineral occurs naturally in eggs, meat, dairy, beans, and nuts, and your body genuinely needs it for strong bones, for energy production inside every cell, for repairing tissue. But there is a second kind of phosphorus, one that isn't grown in a field or raised on a farm. It's manufactured in a chemical plant, and it's mixed, injected, or sprayed into an enormous share of the food sold in an ordinary grocery store. It's called sodium phosphate, and it hides under more than a dozen different names on an ingredient label. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. Unlike the phosphorus tucked naturally inside a chicken breast or a handful of almonds, this manufactured version is absorbed by your body almost completely, somewhere close to 90% of it, compared to less than half from whole, unprocessed food. That difference sounds small. It isn't. Because the organ responsible for clearing the extra load, day after day, meal after meal, is your kidneys. Today, I'm going to walk you through what sodium phosphate additives actually are, how they're fundamentally different from the salt shaker on your table, the way decades of steady exposure can quietly calcify soft tissue, and exactly how to read a label so you can spot these additives before they end up on your plate. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how your body normally handles phosphorus. Think of phosphorus like sand carried along in a river. In a healthy young river, the current is strong. Sand moves through, gets filtered out at certain points, and never piles up anywhere. Your kidneys act as that filtration system. Every day, they pull excess phosphorus out of your bloodstream and send it out of the body, keeping the level in a narrow, stable range. This process is managed by a small, elegant hormonal feedback loop. When phosphorus rises in your blood, your bones release a hormone called FGF23. Think of FGF23 as a foreman shouting instructions down the line. It signals the kidneys to dump more phosphorus into the urine, and it also tells another hormone, parathyroid hormone, to help pull the extra mineral back into balance. In a young, healthy body, this system works quietly in the background, correcting itself dozens of times a day without you ever noticing. But rivers slow down. Starting somewhere in your 40s, kidney filtration capacity begins a slow, steady decline, roughly 1% a year for most people, even without any diagnosed kidney disease. As that current slows, the sand doesn't disappear. It starts to settle. And where it settles matters enormously, because excess phosphorus doesn't just float harmlessly in the blood. Over years, it can deposit into the walls of blood vessels and into soft tissue, a process researchers call ectopic calcification. So the question becomes, can you influence how much sand you're asking that slowing river to carry? And the answer is yes, largely by paying attention to where the extra phosphorus in your diet is actually coming from. Here is where the science gets specific, and where the distinction between natural and additive phosphorus becomes critical. Naturally occurring phosphorus in foods like meat, eggs, and beans is bound up inside organic molecules, phytates, and proteins, that your digestive system has to work to break apart. Only somewhere between 40 and 60% of that phosphorus actually makes it into your bloodstream. Your gut, in a sense, throttles the flow. Sodium phosphate additives skip that step entirely. They're already in an inorganic, free form, which means your intestine absorbs them almost on contact, close to 90%, sometimes higher. So a chicken breast injected with a phosphate solution and a plain chicken breast might look identical on a nutrition label's phosphorus line, but your body treats them very differently. One trickles in slowly. The other floods in fast. Researchers at a major U.S. academic medical center analyzed the phosphorus content of dozens of popular fast food and packaged grocery items and found that roughly half of the most commonly purchased fast food items contained an added phosphate additive, and in most cases, that additive wasn't reflected in the nutrient databases doctors and dietitians typically rely on. In other words, the phosphorus on paper often understates the phosphorus your body actually absorbs. That matters because of what chronically elevated phosphate does to FGF23, that foreman hormone from a moment ago. Research published in the Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology has found that a diet consistently high in phosphate additives is linked to persistently elevated FGF23, even in people whose kidneys are otherwise functioning normally. An elevated FGF23 isn't a harmless lab number. It has been associated, in multiple population studies, with thickening of the heart's left ventricle and stiffening of blood vessel walls, essentially, early calcification of soft tissue that is normally supposed to stay flexible. A separate analysis of National Health Survey data, following more than 9,000 American adults over roughly a decade, found that among people with even mildly reduced kidney function, higher dietary phosphorus intake was associated with a measurably higher risk of death over the follow-up period, independent of age or other health conditions. Now, association isn't the same as proof of cause. But taken together with the mechanism, elevated phosphate, elevated FGF23, vascular and tissue calcification, it paints a consistent picture. Here's the part that surprises most people. This isn't a concern reserved for someone already diagnosed with kidney disease. Kidney function declines gradually and silently for most adults starting in midlife, often well before any blood test flags a problem. Think of it like a slow leak in a tire. The tire still holds air, still gets you where you're going, but it's working harder than it should, and it has less reserve capacity if something else goes wrong. A heavy, steady diet of additive phosphate asks that already strained system to work even harder, day after day, for years before any symptom shows up. And this is where knowing your food sources comes in, because the additive form is the one you actually have the most control over. So let's talk about where sodium phosphate is actually hiding, because it isn't limited to one obvious culprit. It's threaded through an entire category of everyday convenience foods. First, processed deli meats and bacon. Manufacturers add sodium phosphate, often listed as sodium tripolyphosphate, to help the meat retain moisture and stay tender after slicing. At the cellular level, this is pure, rapidly absorbed inorganic phosphate, the exact form that spikes your blood levels fastest. Scan the ingredient list specifically for any word containing phosphate. If it's there, treat that package as an occasional food rather than a daily lunch staple, and look for deli counters that slice meat fresh without an injected brine, or packages explicitly labeled no phosphates added. Second, processed cheese products, the individually wrapped slices, cheese spreads, and shelf-stable shredded cheese blends. Here, sodium phosphate and related compounds act as emulsifiers, keeping the cheese smooth and preventing it from separating when melted. The trade-off for that perfect melt is another dose of highly absorbable phosphate. A simple swap: buy a block of real cheese and shred or slice it yourself. It melts differently, but your kidneys will thank you. Third, enhanced or pre-brined poultry. Look closely at the fine print on a package of chicken breasts, and you'll often find a line reading something like, contains up to 15% of a solution of water, salt, and sodium phosphate. That solution is injected directly into the meat to plump it up and keep it juicy during cooking. Cooking does not remove it. If you want that same juicy texture, brine your own chicken at home in salt water, with a squeeze of lemon or a splash of vinegar, and you get the moisture without the manufactured additive. Fourth, dark colas and certain flavored bottled beverages. Here the additive shows up as phosphoric acid, which gives cola its sharp, tangy edge and helps extend shelf life. Because it's a liquid, it's absorbed essentially instantly. If this is a daily habit, treating it as occasional rather than routine, and swapping in sparkling water with a splash of real fruit juice, meaningfully lowers your overall additive load. Fifth, refrigerated biscuit dough, pancake and baking mixes, and many packaged baked goods. These often rely on phosphate-based leavening agents, like sodium acid pyrophosphate or monocalcium phosphate, to help the dough rise quickly and evenly. Baking from scratch with old-fashioned baking soda, or seeking out mixes that specifically list baking soda rather than a phosphate compound, sidesteps this source entirely. Sixth, and this one catches people off guard, restaurant and fast food chicken, fries, and pre-marinated proteins. Restaurants aren't required to list ingredients the way packaged food is, so phosphate-based marinades and par-fry treatments can be present without ever appearing on a menu. This is less about avoiding restaurants altogether, and more about recognizing that frequent fast food meals are a meaningfully different phosphate exposure than a home-cooked plate of the same foods. Seventh, frozen prepared meals and instant noodle or rice cups. These convenience meals often combine several phosphate sources at once, a processed protein, a cheese or cream sauce, and a leavened starch, in a single package. Because the additive is spread across multiple components, the total load can add up quickly even in a modest-looking portion. If frozen meals are a regular part of your week, checking the ingredient list for phosphate compounds is especially worthwhile here, since these products vary enormously from one brand to another. Put together, the pattern across all 7 of these is the same. Look for the root word phosphate anywhere in an ingredient list, understand that cooking method doesn't neutralize it, and lean toward fresh, minimally processed versions of the foods you already eat. That single habit addresses the overwhelming majority of additive exposure for most people. Now let's cover a few mistakes people commonly make once they start paying attention to this. The first mistake is assuming that a low sodium label means low phosphate. It doesn't. Manufacturers sometimes replace some of the salt in a reduced sodium product with a potassium or phosphate blend to preserve flavor and shelf stability, which means a low sodium version can occasionally carry just as much, or more, additive phosphate as the regular version. Always check the ingredient list itself, not just the front of package claim. The second mistake is believing that boiling, rinsing, or draining removes the additive. Sodium phosphate is water-soluble, but it's typically bound into the food's matrix during processing, injected deep into muscle tissue or blended throughout a batter. Draining the liquid off a package of deli meat or rinsing bacon under the tap does essentially nothing to reduce what's already been absorbed into the food itself. The third mistake is reading only the first 3 or 4 ingredients and stopping there. Phosphate additives are frequently listed further down an ingredient list, but because they're absorbed so efficiently, even a modest quantity contributes meaningfully to your total daily load. Scan the entire list, not just the headline items. The fourth mistake is swinging too far in the other direction and becoming afraid of naturally phosphorus-rich whole foods, cutting back on eggs, dairy, salmon, or beans. That's an overcorrection. The organic phosphorus in whole foods is absorbed slowly and partially, and it comes bundled with protein, calcium, and other nutrients your body needs. The concern here is specifically the manufactured, inorganic additive form, not phosphorus in general. So what can you actually expect if you start reducing your intake of these additives? Within the first few days, for most people this is invisible, there's no dramatic symptom to notice, because phosphate balance is tightly regulated in the short term regardless of diet. That's normal, and it doesn't mean nothing is happening. Over the following weeks, as your overall additive exposure drops, researchers have observed reductions in circulating FGF23 levels in people who shift away from heavily processed, phosphate additive-laden diets toward whole food patterns. Lower FGF23 signaling means less of that chronic pressure on the pathway linked to vascular stiffening. Over months, this becomes less about anything you'll feel directly, and more about the trajectory you're on. Studies looking at long-term dietary patterns associate lower additive phosphate intake with better preserved vascular flexibility and, in people with reduced kidney function, a slower rate of decline. This is not an overnight transformation. It's a shift in the cumulative burden your kidneys carry over years and decades. It's worth being honest about what this timeline does and doesn't promise. You will not wake up one morning and feel your kidneys working better. What you're doing instead is lowering the daily demand placed on a system that naturally loses capacity with age, giving it more room to keep doing its job well for longer. That's a quieter kind of progress, but over the span of a decade, it's the kind that shows up on lab work and in how well your body holds up. Let's finish with a handful of practical tips that make all of this easier to actually live with. When you're standing in the grocery aisle, do a quick scan for any word starting with phosphate, pyrophosphate, polyphosphate, before you put something in your cart. It takes about 5 seconds once it becomes habit. When you're at the meat and deli counter, ask directly whether the sliced meat or the poultry has been injected with a phosphate solution. Many butchers and deli staff know the answer, and some stores carry an unenhanced option specifically for this reason. Cook double batches of your own marinades and brines on a weekend, using salt, herbs, citrus, and vinegar, and freeze portions. That way, reaching for real food is just as convenient as reaching for the pre-seasoned package. Pair naturally phosphorus-containing meals with calcium-rich foods, like leafy greens or dairy, since calcium and phosphorus interact in the gut in ways that can modestly reduce how much phosphorus you absorb from a given meal. And if you already know your kidney function is reduced, or if you're managing a condition like hypertension or diabetes that affects the kidneys over time, bring this topic directly to your doctor or a registered renal dietitian. They can check your actual phosphate and kidney function labs and give you guidance calibrated to your specific numbers, not a general estimate. One more habit worth building: keep a rough mental tally rather than aiming for perfection. If lunch came from a deli counter, let dinner be something you cooked from scratch. Balancing your week this way, rather than treating every single meal as a pass-fail test, is far more sustainable, and it's realistically how most people actually succeed at a change like this over the long run. Here's the core idea to walk away with. Your body was built to handle the phosphorus that occurs naturally in real food, filtered slowly, absorbed partially, kept in balance by a hormonal system that's been fine-tuned over millions of years. What it wasn't built for is the fast, near total absorption of manufactured phosphate additives, meal after meal, for decades. The actionable step is simple: learn to spot the word phosphate on a label, and lean toward the fresh, minimally processed version of the foods you already love. You don't need to overhaul your entire diet overnight, and you don't need to fear phosphorus itself. You just need to know where the manufactured version is hiding, and now you do.